I want you to understand something before I tell you any of it. I was not a soldier. I never carried a blade in my life. My people had a word for what I was, Veil Shar, a keeper of records. I wrote down what happened so that the ones who came after would know. That was my whole purpose. I counted ships. I counted the dead. I wrote the names of worlds that knelt and the names of the few that did not, and I wrote them so neatly that the court could read them by candlefire and feel proud. So when I tell you what I saw on that dust world, you should believe me, because I had no reason to make humans into monsters. I had every reason to make them small. And I cannot. We came down out of the dark expecting a ceremony. That is the part nobody wants me to say out loud anymore. They want the story to be about treachery, about cowardice, about how the humans broke some sacred law of war. But that is not what happened. We came expecting them to kneel, because every world before them had knelt, and we had stopped imagining the day one wouldn't. You have to picture us the way we were then. The Celt Dominion had not lost in 9 generations. 9. I had personally recorded the surrender of 41 species. 41. Some of them were old when we were young. Some of them had cities made of light. They all knelt the same way in the end, slow, with their heads down, with that quiet animal understanding that there was simply nothing else to be done. It made you lazy, that kind of winning. I'll admit it now. It made the whole fleet lazy. The world was called Maddox Run. A human had named it. Obviously, they name everything after people, which I found strange at the time and find unbearably sad now. It was a frontier colony, mining mostly. Iron and rare salts and something they pulled out of the deep rock that they wouldn't tell us about even at the end. The air was thin and dry. The wind never stopped. Everything was the color of old rust, the ground, the sky at dusk, the faces of the people who lived there. Dust got into everything, into the seals of our armor, into the joints of our walkers, into my records, so that to this day if I open the original logs, the pages leave red on my fingers. The wind made a sound there, a low, constant moan like the planet itself was tired. I hated it for the first day. By the end I was grateful for it because it covered some of the other sounds. We made orbit with 11 ships. 11 for a colony of maybe 90,000 people. That should tell you how seriously we took them. The protocol was old and simple. We broadcast the summons on every frequency they had. We have done this 10,000 times. The summons says, in the plainest terms a species can understand, your world now belongs to the throne. Send your leader. Have them kneel. Live. We waited. And the humans sent us a man. His name was Aldous Rain. I learned it later, and I have written it so many times since that my hand knows it without my mind. He was the colony administrator, not a king, not a warlord, a man whose actual job before any of this was overseeing water rights and shipping schedules, an accountant of dust and rock. He came up in a battered little shuttle that we very nearly shot down on principle, because it was leaking atmosphere from a seam in the hull and we thought it might be a weapon. It was not a weapon. It was just old. Everything they had was old. That was the first thing that should have warned us, honestly, not their weakness, but the way they used what they had until it had nothing left to give. He walked into the receiving hall of the flagship with dust still on his boots. He hadn't even cleaned them. I remember the high adjutant's antennae going flat with offense at that. A man comes before the representatives of the throne, and he does not clean his boots. But Rain, you see, hadn't come to grovel, he'd come to talk. He was an unremarkable creature to look at. Humans are. They are soft and slow, and they have these wide, flat faces that show everything they feel, which I found grotesque at first and later understood to be a kind of terrible honesty. He was old by their standards, gray in the hair, lines around the eyes. His hands shook just slightly, and the court took that for fear. It wasn't fear. I figured that out much later. The man was simply tired. He had a sick colony to run and not enough water, and now there were 11 warships over his head, and he was tired, and he came anyway. The voice of the throne, that was the officer who spoke for the sovereign in the field, read him the terms. Surrender, tribute, a garrison, the usual. The voice read it the way you read something you've read 10,000 times with no weight in it, because why would there be weight in it? And Rain listened to all of it, politely, with his head tilted the way humans do when they are paying attention. And then he said, "No. I need you to understand how strange that was, how genuinely, physically strange it was to be in that room. Nobody says no, not like that, not calmly. Worlds beg. Worlds plead for terms, for time, for mercy for their young. I had recorded 1,000 kinds of yes, the proud yes, the broken yes, the yes that is really a curse. I had never recorded a no. The Dominion did not have a procedure for a no. The voice of the throne actually paused and looked at the High Adjutant because he genuinely did not know what came next. Rain saw all of that. He was watching us very carefully, that tired old man with dust on his boots. He saw that we didn't have an answer ready. And something changed in his face, just a little, a kind of settling. He said, and I wrote it down within the hour so the words are exact, he said, "You came here with 11 ships to frighten 90,000 people. I think that means you've never had to fight for anything. I think you've forgotten what it costs. We haven't. Out here, everything costs. So no, we're not going to kneel. And I'd ask you to leave, but I don't think you will, so I won't waste the breath." Then he asked if he could have some water before the trip back down, because the air on the ship was dry and his throat hurt. We gave him water. The High Adjutant ordered it almost reflexively, too stunned to refuse. The man drank it, thanked the servant by gesture, set the cup down carefully so it wouldn't spill, and walked back to his leaking shuttle. I remember watching him go and thinking, I'm ashamed of it now, but I'll tell you the truth, I thought. What a foolish little creature. I thought he had just killed his entire colony with his pride. I had the order of operations exactly backwards. He hadn't killed them. He'd warned us, and we were too proud to hear it. We began the bombardment the next morning, planetary dawn. It was meant to be a formality. You crack the defensive grid, you scatter the population, you land your soldiers, you raise the standard, you record the surrender, you move on. I had the surrender document already half-drafted. I'm not ashamed of much, but I am ashamed of that. I had written the words, and so Maddox Run did yield before a single shot was fired. The first thing that went wrong was small. The orbital cannons opened up on the colony's primary settlement, a sprawl of low buildings and dig sites, and that one tall water tower that you could see for miles. And the shots landed, and the dust came up in a great red curtain, and we waited for it to settle so we could assess. And when it settled, the settlement was empty. Not destroyed, empty. They had moved everyone, all 90,000, into the mines. You have to understand what these humans had been doing for the entire night, that the High Adjutant spent congratulating himself on his handling of the foolish administrator. They had been going down, into the rock, into tunnels they had spent 40 years carving, that they knew like the lines of their own hands, that no orbital weapon in the Dominion could touch because rock is rock, and there is a great deal of it, and ours is not the only species that learned the simplest defense in the universe is go deeper. We were bombing an empty town. We were very good at it. The second thing that went wrong was not small at all. We landed soldiers. Of course we did. You can't take a world from orbit if the population is underground. You have to go down and dig them out, world after world, the same dull, bloody arithmetic. We had a name for it, the harvest. We landed 3 legions of the ironclad, our finest. Walkers and shock troops and the big armored advance frames that nothing on a frontier world should have been able to scratch. They walked into the dust, expecting to herd a frightened, soft little population back up into the light. The humans were waiting for them. Here is the thing I have spent the rest of my life trying to explain to my own people, and have largely failed to, because they do not want to hear it. The humans of Maddox Run were not soldiers. I keep saying this and you must keep hearing it. They were miners. They were people who fixed pumps and hauled ore and drank too much and got into fistfights on rest day and loved their ugly little settlement in the dust. They had a defense militia, the way frontier colonies do, with old guns and not enough of them. But they knew the ground, every meter of it, above and below. And they had spent 40 years learning to do one thing better than any species I have ever recorded. They had learned to survive a place that was actively, patiently trying to kill them. The thin air, the dust that scarred their lungs, the cold nights and the burning days and the cave-ins and the machinery that mangled a careless hand. They lived every single day at the edge of dying, and they had stopped being afraid of it, the way you stop hearing a sound you've heard your whole life. We sent the most disciplined soldiers in the galaxy against people who were simply not afraid to die. And it turns out that is the worst possible matchup. It is the only matchup that has ever beaten us. The First Legion went into the tunnel network and did not come back out. I was on the flagship when the report started. I remember the room. I remember the way the light from the tactical display flickered red across everyone's faces, and how at first the officers were annoyed, the way you're annoyed by an inconvenience, and how slowly, over about 4 hours, the annoyance turned into something I had never seen on a Celt face before. They turned the explosives on us. Their own mining charges. They knew exactly which supports held up which tunnels, and they let our soldiers march in deeper, chasing the sound of voices that were never there, and then they brought the world down on top of them. They flooded sections with the gas they pulled out of the deep rock. That was the thing they wouldn't tell us about. It turns out it was poisonous, and they'd been breathing the edge of it for 40 years and lived, and our soldiers breathed it for 9 minutes and did not. They cut our supply lines with rock falls. They picked off the walkers in the narrow places where the big frames couldn't turn. They knew where the dark was and we did not, and in the dark, under the rock, our technology was just weight. And when the survivors of the First Legion tried to retreat to the surface, the humans were up there too, in the dust, in the wind, dug in behind the rusted hulks of their own mining equipment, with those old guns, and they were patient, and they did not miss much. By the end of the first day, we had lost a legion, a whole legion, to miners. I stopped drafting the surrender document. I started a new one, a casualty list. I told myself it was temporary. The voice of the throne sent down a demand for parley, which was, in itself, an admission. We do not parley with worlds we are taking. We dictate. But the voice asked for a meeting, and after a day's delay the humans agreed, and they sent up that same tired old man, Aldous Rain, in that same leaking shuttle. He had dust on his boots again, more of it now. And there was a bandage on his forearm, dark in the middle, and he moved like everything hurt, because by then everything probably did. The voice of the throne, and I was in the room, I recorded it. The voice tried to take the high ground, tried to speak of the waste of human life, of the mercy still available, of the inevitability of the throne. All the old words. They had worked on 41 species. Rain let him finish. He was good at that, letting people finish. Then he said very quietly, "You keep using that word. Inevitable. You said it last time too. You should know out here the only thing that's inevitable is the dust. Everything else we argue with. You want this world. Then every single one of us is the price, and we are a lot less afraid of paying it than you are." And then he said the thing that I think the voice never reported back to the throne, because it was too dangerous to repeat, and that I have therefore made it my life's work to repeat as often as I can. He said, "You sent your best soldiers into our home in the dark, and we are still here and most of them are not. Send more. We'll be here. We're always here. This is the only home we've got and we have nowhere else to be." He didn't say it like a threat. That was the worst part. He said it like a man reporting the weather, like a simple fact about the universe that we were, frankly, a little slow to grasp. The voice ordered the parley ended and Rain escorted off. As they took him out, he stopped. They let him stop. Nobody quite dared to push him, and he looked at me. At me, the Veil Shar, the one creature in the room holding a recorder instead of a weapon. He looked at me and he said, "You writing all this down?" I said yes. I don't know why I answered, "We do not speak to the conquered." And he nodded slow like that was the right answer, the only sensible thing in the whole room. And he said, "Good, somebody should get it right." Then they took him away, and I sat there with my recorder, and for the first time in 9 generations of unbroken victory, I was afraid. We sent the Second Legion in 3 days later and we were smarter about it. I'll give the Iron Marshal that much. He'd learned. We didn't chase voices into the dark this time. We took the tunnels meter by meter, sealing as we went, gas screening every section, advancing in a slow, grinding line. It cost us, but it worked. We were pushing them back, down, into the deepest galleries where there was nowhere left to go. And I started to believe again. I'm telling you the truth even when it shames me. I started drafting the surrender document a second time, because the tactical display showed our advance as a slow, inexorable red tide pushing the little human signals into a corner. And I thought, there, now they will kneel, now the arithmetic has caught up with them. What I didn't understand, what none of us understood, is that the humans had never once intended to win that way. They were never trying to hold the tunnels. They were trying to make us commit, to make us pour our soldiers down into the deep, legion by legion, ship's complement by ship's complement, until the fleet above was thin and the army below was deep and far from home and certain, absolutely certain, that the war was nearly won. They were waiting for us to feel safe. They were waiting for the sovereign. Because here is the thing about the Celt Dominion that I have not yet told you, the thing that made all of it possible. We did not just conquer worlds, we consecrated them. And a world could only be truly, finally taken when the sovereign himself set foot upon it and spoke the word of binding. It was the oldest law. The king does not send a world into the dominion. The king gathers it in person with his own voice, standing on its soil. It had become a ceremony of pure theater. By my time, the sovereign would arrive only at the very end, when a world was already broken and pacified and safe, to stand in a cleared and guarded plaza and speak the word over a kneeling population and accept their tribute and be home for dinner. The danger had been ceremonially removed from it generations ago. It was a coronation, not a battle. The sovereign had not stood on a contested world in 9 generations, because for 9 generations there had been no contested worlds. The sovereign's name was Caron Vale, the diadem of the Celt, the unbroken throne. He was young, as our kings go, and he had never in his life been told no by anything, and he had certainly never bled. And the Iron Marshal, watching that slow red tide push the humans into their last deep corner, sent word to the throneship that Maddox Run was ready for binding. He told the sovereign it was safe. I was on the surface when the sovereign came down because the Veil Shar must witness the binding. That is the whole point of me. I stood in the cleared plaza they had made out of the ruins of the human settlement, in the red dust, with the wind moaning its endless tired moan, and I watched the royal lighter descend in a column of fire, and I thought we had won. Everyone thought we had won. That's the thing you have to hold in your mind. The sovereign came down onto a world he had been promised was beaten. The honor guard formed up 500 of the throne's own diademite, the most beautiful and useless soldiers in the galaxy, ceremonial troops in mirror-bright armor who had never fought anything in their lives. The sovereign walked down the ramp in his white and gold, with the diadem itself on his brow catching the dull red sun, and he was magnificent, and he was bored, and you could see the boredom on him, the boredom of a creature who has been told his whole life that nothing can touch him and has come to believe it the way you believe in the ground. The plan was simple. They would bring up a delegation of the human survivors from the deep galleries, beaten, exhausted, the fight finally crushed out of them, and the sovereign would speak the word of binding over them, and Maddox Run would be the 42nd world, and I would write, and so it yielded, and we would all go home. They brought up the humans. And the humans were not beaten. I will tell you exactly what I saw, because I was 30 meters away, and I have replayed it every day of my life since. They came up out of the mine in a long, ragged line, hundreds of them, guarded by our soldiers, and they were filthy and exhausted, and many of them were hurt. That much was real. The exhaustion was real. They had been fighting in the dark for 11 days. They looked like the dead. But they walked upright. All of them. That should have been the warning. A beaten people does not walk like that. A beaten people folds. These people came up out of the ground with their heads level and their eyes forward, and they looked at the sovereign in his white and gold the way you look at a man who has wandered into the wrong room. And Aldous Rain was at the front of them. He looked terrible. The bandage on his arm had been joined by others. One eye was swollen half shut. He was leaning on a younger woman. I learned later she was the militia captain, a person named Vance, and he could barely stand. He had been down there the whole time, the colony administrator, the accountant of dust, fighting in the dark with the rest of them. He had not stayed safe. That was not a thing these creatures seemed to know how to do. The voice of the throne began the ceremony. He commanded the humans to kneel for the binding. Nobody knelt. And the sovereign bored, magnificent, certain the sovereign actually smiled. Because he thought it was the last little flare of pride before the end, the kind he'd read about, the kind that made the eventual surrender taste sweeter. He stepped forward off the ramp, onto the soil of Maddox Run to deliver the word himself, close up, where the humans could feel the full weight of him. He stepped down into the dust. And the dust is where the next part happens. The sovereign stepped down into the dust, and for one heartbeat nothing happened at all. I want you to sit in that heartbeat with me because everything turned on it. The wind moaned. The red dust drifted across the cleared plaza. 500 diademites stood in their mirror armor, beautiful and useless. Caron Vale, diadem of the Celt, the unbroken throne, walked toward a line of filthy, exhausted, upright humans with the small, confident smile of a creature who has never once in his life been wrong about anything. And Aldous Rain let go of the woman holding him up. He straightened. It cost him, I could see it cost him, the whole effort of it written plain across that wide, honest human face. But he straightened, and he stood there on his own, swaying a little in the wind, and he looked at the king of the galaxy walking toward him, and he said one word. Not to the sovereign, to his own people. He said now. It was the woman, Vance, the militia captain. She moved before the word was even finished, and I have never in all my records seen anything move like that. Our soldiers train for a lifetime. The diademite are bred for grace. None of them moved like a human who has decided, completely, all at once, to spend everything she has in the next 4 seconds and keep nothing back for later. She went past the voice of the throne before he understood she was moving. She went under the reach of the nearest diademite. Those ceremonial fools actually flinched back from her, flinched, because nothing was supposed to be able to come at them, and their bodies didn't know what to do. And she hit the sovereign low and hard, the whole weight of her driving up under the white and gold, and the most powerful being in 9 generations went down into the dust like a sack of ore. The diadem came off his brow. I saw it. It rolled in the red dust, and a human boot came down on it, and it did not roll any further. And then they were all moving. Understand, they had nothing. This is what I cannot make my own people accept all these years later. The humans of Maddox Run had no plan to seize the fleet. They had no secret weapon waiting in the deep rock. They had old guns and emptied-out charges and bodies that were already half broken from 11 days in the dark. By every measure the Dominion uses to weigh a war, they had already lost. The arithmetic was finished. They should have knelt. But they had understood something about us that we had never understood about ourselves. They had understood that the entire Dominion, every ship, every legion, every law, 9 generations of unbroken winning, all of it ran through one creature in white and gold who had never bled. We had built a galaxy that could only be bound by a king who stepped, in person, onto the soil. We had made our greatest strength stand alone in the dust. 30 meters from people who had nothing left to lose. And the humans, who lived every day at the edge of dying, who had stopped being afraid of it the way you stop hearing the wind. The humans looked at our magnificent king and did not see a god. They saw a hostage. What happened next was not a battle. I have recorded a great many battles, and I will not dishonor the word by using it here. It was something faster and uglier and more total than a battle. The Diademite tried to close ranks around their fallen king, and the humans were already inside the ranks, already past the armor, already in the close ugly space where mirror-bright ceremonial plate means nothing and a mining tool means everything. They came up out of the kneeling line all at once, the whole beaten delegation, hundreds of them, and it turned out the exhaustion was real but the surrender never had been. They had walked up out of the dark upright on purpose. They had let us bring them to the one place the king would be. Rain's voice cut across all of it, hoarse and cracking and absolutely steady. Don't kill him. Don't you dare kill him. We need him breathing. And that order, that one order, is the reason I am alive to tell you any of this. Because the moment the humans had the sovereign on the ground, the moment Vance had her forearm across his throat, and a mining charge pressed flat against the white-tanned gold over his hearts, the whole calculus of the galaxy inverted in the space of a breath. 3 legions in the deep, 11 warships above, 500 diademite in the plaza, and every single one of them in that instant belonged to the filthy, exhausted woman kneeling on their king's chest in the red dust. Because she would do it. You could see she would do it. That was the thing our soldiers had never faced and did not know how to face, an enemy who was not bluffing, who had brought no fear up out of the dark with them, who would absolutely trade their own lives for his and considered it, frankly, a bargain. The Iron Marshal, to his eternal disgrace, and I record it without pity, the Iron Marshal ordered the Diademite to stand down, to save the king. It was the correct order. It was the only order. And it was the end of us. They made him walk. That is the part the throne has spent all these years trying to erase, and the part I have spent all these years refusing to let them. They could have carried him. They could have dragged him senseless. But Rain, that tired old accountant of dust, leaning on a younger man now because he could no longer stand on his own, Rain said no. He said, and I wrote it down before the dust had even settled, he said, "He walks. He came down here to make us kneel in our own dirt. He can walk through it first." And so they brought the sovereign up onto his feet, and they bound his hands, and they walked the diadem of the Celt the length of that plaza, through the red dust, past the ruins of the settlement his fleet had shelled, past the line of his own ceremonial guard standing frozen in their mirror armor with their weapons lowered, because to lift them was to kill him. The wind moaned. The dust came up around his white-tanned gold and turned it red, the way it turned everything red eventually, the way it had been turning these people red for 40 years. He stumbled once. The ground was uneven and he had never walked on broken ground in his life, and he stumbled and went down to one knee in the dust. He knelt, finally, the one creature who had come to make a whole world kneel, and a human reached down and hauled him back up by the collar, not gently, and kept him moving. I watched the king of the galaxy walk through the dust of a frontier world with his head down, and I understood that 9 generations had just ended, and I wrote it down, because that tired old human had asked me to get it right, and I have spent my life trying. The terms were not negotiated. That is the wrong word. The way battle was the wrong word. The humans did not negotiate. They simply held the only thing that mattered and waited for us to understand our situation, which did not take long. The 11 ships withdrew. The legions came up out of the deep, what was left of them, and they came up with their weapons grounded, filing past the line of humans like a defeated thing, which they were. The sovereign was held on the surface, in the dust, in a chair they brought up from the mine offices, with the militia captain Vance never more than an arm's length from him and a charge never far from his chest, until the very last Celt soldier was off the world, and the fleet was breaking orbit. And then, and this is the part that I think shows you most clearly what these creatures are, then they let him go. They didn't kill him. They could have. By every law of our own dominion they had every right. We had certainly never spared a defeated king. They had him, bound and beaten and shamed, the whole galaxy's tyranny kneeling in their dirt, and they could have ended the Celt line in the dust and no one would have called it unjust. They put him back on his lighter, and they sent him home. Rain stood there in the wind as the lighter rose. He looked like he might fall over. He probably should have been dead 3 times over by then. And one of the younger ones, a boy, really, barely past his growing, asked him why. Why let him live after everything? After the legions and the gas and the 11 days in the dark and the friends they'd put into the rock. And Rain watched the lighter climb up into that rust-colored sky, and he said quietly, just to the boy, but the wind carried it and I was close enough. I was always close enough. That was my whole purpose, he said. Because a dead king is a war. A live king who walked through our dust is a warning. I want them to have to look at him every day. I want them to remember he bled. Killing him's easy. Making them live with him, that costs them forever. The boy didn't understand. I'm not sure I fully understood either then. I understand now. Caron Vale went home, and the Celt Dominion did not march again. Oh, there were councils. There was fury. There were grand speeches in the high halls about vengeance, about returning to Maddox Run with 1,000 ships and unmaking it down to the bedrock. I recorded all of them. I recorded the slow way those speeches died in the mouths of the ones making them, because every council ended the same way, with someone asking the question no one could answer. If 90,000 miners did that with old guns and the dark, what happens when we land on a human world that's ready for us? Nobody knew. That was the thing. We had never lost, so we had never learned the shape of our own breaking, and now we had felt it once in the dust, and we were afraid of it the way you become afraid of a sound you finally learned to hear. And the sovereign himself, the unbroken throne, who came home very much broken, said the thing that ended it. He'd been quiet for a long time after his return. He didn't speak much. The diadem sat on his brow again, but it had dust in the engraving that never quite came out, and he never had it cleaned, which the court found unsettling and never had the courage to mention. When they brought him the grand plan for the 1,000-ship vengeance, he looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down, and he said, "They walked me through their dirt and they let me live so I would tell you not to go back. I am telling you, we do not go back." And we did not. I am old now, older than I ever expected to be, given how that day might have gone. I'm still a Vale Shar, still a keeper of records, but I keep a different kind of record now than I used to. I used to count the worlds that knelt. Now I write down what happened on Maddox Run, over and over, in as many tongues as I can manage, and I give it to anyone who will take it, because the throne would very much prefer that it be forgotten, and I have decided in my old age to disappoint them. People ask me what I learned. They want it small enough to carry, so here is what I tell them. We thought strength was never having to bleed. We built a whole galaxy on that idea, 9 generations, 41 worlds, a king so far above the fighting that he came down only to collect what was already won. We thought we were strong because nothing could touch us. And then we met people who lived every single day with death at their elbow, on a poor world in the dust, and had simply made their peace with it, and that turned out to be a kind of strength we had no weapon for. They weren't braver than us. I don't even think they were stronger, not in the way we measured. They just had nothing left to be afraid of, and we had everything, and it turns out that everything is very, very heavy to carry into the dark. The aliens wanted a war. I should know. I helped plan it. We came down out of the black with 11 ships and 9 generations of certainty, expecting a ceremony. And a tired old man with dust on his boots looked at our god, and saw a creature that could be made to walk. That's the whole story. That's what I was asked to get right. We came to make a world kneel in its own dirt. We left having learned, too late, that some people would rather drag a king through the dust than spend one day on their knees in it, and that the difference between those two kinds of people is the only thing in the universe that the throne could never conquer and never replace and never, ever forget.